Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Derek Top. I'm the research director with Opus Research, and we're excited to get into the topic of no guaranteed identity and no zero trust. We're looking forward to a lively discussion here. We have us all right here. I was going to talk a little bit about this is a live webinar, so please do feel free to ask questions, make comments all the way throughout. We definitely have a Q&A session planned, but we're really here for a lively discussion. So like I said, I'm Derek Top. I'm the research director with Opus Research, and we've been covering voice biometrics and authentication, security, and fraud prevention for many years. And I'll pass it off to Dan, who's going to.
And I'm Dan Miller, the lead analyst and founder here, and I want to get right into the meat of what we want to talk about, but want to introduce our two. While we're considered subject matter experts, but these are the people with real world experience implementing the solutions that we've been writing about for 2 decades. On my right, I think, as presented here, is Matt Smallman. Matt, want to give a little personal background?
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Smallman. I'm an independent consultant. I specialize in helping call centers and organizations improve their security processes. And I recently published a book, Unlock Your Call Center, which is tactfully positioned just here. And I'm really excited to join this topic today because it's really interesting, kind of flipping what is often a consumer-based authentication methods and looking at how those can be used to better secure the enterprise.
Right. And for this session, I'm going to be Dan M. And below me here is Dan Thornhill, or who will be Dan T. And a little bit about yourself, Dan?
Yeah, thank you, Dan M. Yeah, my name's Daniel Thornhill, or Dan T. My background's primarily in telecoms and cybersecurity. I've been working in the voice biometrics space for many 10 plus years. It's an area of particular interest for me and close to my heart. I think, taking the identity of an individual and making it central to, security mechanisms and authentication mechanisms is the way things are progressing and should be progressing to make the world a more secure and safer place for people to interact online, through IoT, through smart speakers, whichever way they choose to as consumers. So yeah, really pleased to be here today, and yeah, it's an exciting topic.
Right, and it's not just one topic. As soon as these slides come up, we've done the introductions. We have a few topics to go through, and I'm going to gloss over the first one about what is zero trust. But just to say that at some point in the past, computer security folks determined that the best way to make sure computers are secure, other than not hooking them up to anything, is to not trust any person or thing that is hooked up to them. And that I think zero trust grew out of that, but it has become really important just recently, well, not just recently, but over the past couple of years, but most dramatically, most recently, around an attack on Uber, global brand name, lots of employees, where an organization, Lapsus, had probably overcome many of the techniques because something like zero trust wasn't put into practice. And I think, Matt, you did a good rundown of our best assessment of what exactly happened here. And I think it will showcase what is meant when we understand what sort of attacks are going on right now.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I think is really interesting is how kind of the cyber attack profile has changed over the last few years, from kind of conventional kind of getting inside the firewall and then compromising the organization from there by compromising a kind of a route in, through to the fact that many organizations have implemented these kind of zero trust approaches, which basically mean that they assume their network's being compromised from the start, and every service requires authentication. And as a result, those authentication processes become quite a burden on the users in those organizations. And we've seen attackers move to kind of quite some low tech methods now. The sort of attacks that we used to see quite prevalent against consumers in financial services, like SMS phishing attacks or email phishing attacks, using those to compromise credentials, and then taking advantage really of the kind of fatigue that many people inside an enterprise have now with many of these multi-factor authentication methods. Like, how many text messages a day do I have to get in order to do my job? How many times do I have to open my authenticator in order to do my job? And actually, that's what we suspect, or what some of the kind of the write-ups of the Uber attack suggest, is that the credentials were identified by using a very simple SMS attack, and that then a victim of that attack just got bored with the number of multi-factor authentication requests they received on their authenticating device, and ultimately pressed accept to one of those, and that was enough for the fraudsters or the attackers to be able to put their foothold in the organization. And we also saw some other attacks, and I think it's up to maybe 120 organizations that have been attacked by this particular group right now, using some pretty low-tech methods in order to get themselves inside the security supply chain and then compromise from there. So yeah, so really interesting how that's evolved over the last few years. And I think even consumers are now seeing this kind of fatigue of having to keep logging into different things all over the place. And it's all for the right reasons, but the processes and the methods we're using to do that are certainly not the most convenient. And when they're not convenient for people, there's a tendency to kind of be a bit lax with them, to choose easy to guess passwords because I've got multi-factor authentication, or to authorize every request because I get dozens of them a day. Yeah, so it's really interesting how the profile's changed.
Yeah. And Dan T, I'm interested in your perspective of the implications of this across what ValidSoft is seeing in the world and bringing and trying to solve here.
Yeah, no, I mean, Matt captured it very well. I mean, I think, firstly, the kind of context for establishing trust have changed, right? You're seeing, as Matt said, this erosion of the perimeter that people were working within has kind of happened. It's grown, right? And you're seeing much more remote working now. You're seeing, effectively, a lot of people have become, in effect, remote contact center operators in the way that they operate in their day-to-day businesses. And historically, like, where strong authentications occurred or being put in place, it's through proxy mechanisms. So whether you're leveraging a personal device like a mobile phone or a telecoms network for sending SMSs, and these, where you're working within known boundaries and secured boundaries, you have these other kind of security mechanisms that you can fall back on, and the erosion of those has fundamentally meant that the only way to really establish trust, the basis of trust or the foundation of trust, is identity, right? So you need to have that identity of the individual central to your authentication mechanisms. And, that's very much where, ValidSoft is focused. It's like, how do we assert the identity of an individual and make that central to an authentication method and a security process, but also to keep that simple and straightforward for the consumer of that authentication. As Matt said, I mean, you can make security really complicated, and that may or may not make it more secure, probably will, but it also makes it less secure because people don't begin using it either improperly or they try to take shortcuts, because fundamentally we're human beings, right? And we do get fatigued, we get tired, we get bored, and human beings are, in essence, always the random factor in any security method. So so we feel identity is the foundation of a strong security method.
Yeah, and at Opus, our legacy has been sort of covering what's going on in customer care contact center and the advent of new technologies. And it strikes me, and you just alluded to this for a second, was during the pandemic and the lockdown, a lot of the contact center were brick and mortar ones were just closed down, and in a very short period of time, you had thousands of people working from their homes, sort of making authentication more urgent, if you will. And Matt said something interesting on the planning call for this. He said, well, something like lapses with Uber, or with these persistent attacks on personnel. Maybe the system admin who had the credentials of a super user, was the target, and probably got more bang for the buck. But the fraud surface right below that turns out to be the tens of thousands of employees that are now out working, logging into the network from their contact center agent workstations. And that gets scary, frankly.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Like these attacks on these enormous tech companies, like they don't employ idiots. The people who are working for them are pretty smart, and these are pretty sophisticated. Whilst low tech, they're pretty well orchestrated attacks, and these guys still fell for them. But that and privileged access and making sure that our kind of most authorized users only have access to the services they need and all the rest of it is all good security principles. But I do think that kind of the thing that gets missed out is just, as you say, that like the tens of thousands of employees who have access to every single line of business system, who it's very hard to do audit and compliance checks on, how they can be used as a vector of attack to get inside an organization, to exfiltrate customer data and ultimately exploit that elsewhere. And I think whilst we do a lot to secure kind of computer access, like how do we actually know that the employee on the phone is the employee we think it is? So it's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
No, sorry. I was going to say, yeah, and actually, taking that, one step further to, contact center agents specifically. I mean, they, contact center agents are not just the face of a company. They are the employees of that company. And furthermore, they're dealing with tons of sensitive data, whether it's personal data or payment data, typically about consumers. So, 99% of people are good actors, but fundamentally, if we look at that particular security model, you may have agents logging in at a particular point, but you don't know when they're receiving calls that it's still that right person receiving those calls. So it's also about where you apply your security and how you apply it, so it's seamless, continuous authentication, if necessary, for particular high risk interactions with consumers. So there's lots of different facets of where and how you apply authentication, and trying to make it as seamless as possible.
Exactly.
So I think we've interestingly danced around some of the kind of the obvious solutions here, and I think that Dan T earlier was kind of suggesting this, like using a device, using authentication, and to make sure we actually have the right individual. But the clear thing is, like, a device is not an individual. A password is not an individual. In order to be really sure that we have the person who is in front of it, who we're supposed to have accessing our networks and our systems and our applications, it has to have some form of dependence on some form of inheritance factor. And that invariably brings us back to biometrics and selecting what the most appropriate biometric is for the particular use case that we're looking at. Because identity is about an individual. It's got to be related to features that are unique to that individual and not stuff that can be stolen in the case of device, or compromised in the case of device, or socially engineered in the case of a password. So I think it's really important that we come back to talk about the importance of inheritance in relating to identity and relating to how that secures the enterprise.
Yeah. And I think that serves up for Dan T to talk a little bit more about, what the concept of services and products that support the trusted employee approach to security in this case.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a very broad question, so I'm going to try to narrow it down to. But I mean, and I'll obviously focus it. I work for ValidSoft, and we have our own focus on how we feel authentication or security should be applied. So we work with a lot of partners like Okta, Duo, and many other strong authentication providers or leaders in the industry. And so what we've done is we've taken our voice biometric technology and augmented their offerings. So we apply what we call precision voice biometrics, and it's a multi-dimensional way of doing it. And this is specifically for a trusted agent. I'll touch on trusted remote agents, or how we can apply it to remote agents shortly. But so what we can do is we can look at both. We can have an individual repeat, let's say, a random code, and that random code can be tied back to specific elements of a transaction if we wanted to, for non-repudiation purposes. But the repetition of that code or random series of numbers means two things. One, we check, is it the right person that's saying it, which is the identity or inherence element of it. And two, are they saying the right thing? So, and that's about looking at any vectors of attack that might be associated to using your voice to authenticate. So again, it's this layered approach. I mean, we're very much advocates of the application of multi-factor authentication. So we're not suggesting get rid of all the other stuff. What we're saying is make sure inherence or identity is central to whatever authentication or security mechanisms you're putting in place, but make sure that the type of inherence you're using makes sense to those use cases as well. So again, it doesn't become cumbersome. One of the real benefits of voice biometrics we see is its applicability to all of these different channels that, particularly in the retail sectors, that consumers operate on. So you get employees coming in through the web, through apps, through VPNs, and you need to create a consistent method of authentication across those, because again, fraudsters or criminal organizations attack different channels. Where remote agents are concerned, it's a slightly different, there's slightly different applications we see. So we still absolutely see the necessity for strong authentication at login, making sure the right person's logging in, accessing your networks, accessing your solutions and services, but also particularly where payment data is concerned, it's making sure that agent is consistently on the calls. You're making sure that the right employee or the right agent is on the right calls, and the right consumer is there as well. So it's kind of you can look at it as like a two-way authentication handshake. So yeah, lots of different applications, but specifically we see precision or voice biometrics with the repetition of random codes to be very user-friendly and extremely strong security model.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the phrases that popped into my head while we were talking is, we're talking about zero trust, but relationships between companies and their customers, relationships between companies and their employees actually have to be trust-based. So, this is really a question of how you encourage trust in the age of zero trust, and it becomes very real. And I want to encourage folks that are watching to use the question tab and ask questions here. The notion of zero trust catching on also implies sort of a different idea of what the defaults are, as if you're starting presuming zero trust rather than sort of setting up a situation where you just accept the logon and things like that. What and I'll point this at Matt, but what do you see evolving as sort of like ground zero for introducing, well, not ground zero, it's ground zero for zero trust. What a horrible thing. But what it means to build zero trust on solid ground.
Well, what I've just been reflecting on it as he discusses them. So one day I'm definitely going to interview you, Dan, and others in the industry about how voice biometrics and at the start kind of started getting commercialized and where its first applications were. And when I kind of cast my mind back there, I think some of the first applications we saw of this technology were actually in enterprise password reset. It was like viewed as a way of increasing efficiency of those organizations, because people had to reset their passwords all the time because we had strange rules about how often they needed to be changed and how complicated they needed to be and all of those kind of things. And that kind of by creating a voice print at that point, it kind of gave us this baseline complete piece of piece of trust that we could say, right, this is the employee, and if they lose their device, they're not in a corporate building, they can't remember their badge number, and they've forgotten their password and maybe even their username. Like we can resort back remotely without needing to be in person in front of them to who they really are. And those kind of applications, there's still many of those deployed all over the place, and organizations still deploying them today. And that's kind of where we started. And I think it's really interesting as we look at kind of some of the approaches that Dan was talking about, Dan T, sorry, which is this kind of, it's almost like two for the price of one. Yes, we're using the voice to make sure it is the individual, but we're also using the voice to say some codes that we know are cryptographically bound to the transaction that's required, and the location that person's in, and the device they're using, and all of those other associated details. It means we're kind of almost getting that kind of two for one in our authentication. And I think it keeps coming back to this kind of lowest common denominator. Like, when all else fails you, how do we really be sure that this person in front of us is the person we want? I've just been really struck over the last weekend. In fact, I've been doing a bit of a personal password and security audit, and there's definitely, as an individual, there's like, I've got 1,000 services in my password manager that I'm logged into, and scarily 300 and something of those had the same password. It was like, okay, I really should do something about this. And if you look at the kind of have I been pawned site, you can see that actually, yes, my password is well known to be my password, and I really should change it. And obviously my bank's not secured with that kind of service and the rest of it. But it just shocked me as frightening the lax security required to actually change those passwords. Many of those accounts I was kind of locked out of, or they had in fact detected that my password had been breached. But their reset processes were woefully inadequate, and thankfully they don't protect anything of real value. But it just frightens me how few organizations actually have that kind of ground truth for their customer. Like, who is this customer as an individual, not as a mailbox hosted by a third party service, not as an ID number issued by a government, not as a phone number issued by a telco, but actually that we ourselves can be confident is the individual. So I think this is just another step in that evolution. I think it almost certainly has to start with employees and having high confidence about the employee being an individual. But I'm also hopeful that that will enable consumers to be better protected in the future as well.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a ramble. Sorry, I had to get in my story about my password.
Yeah. Your life is now an open book, and I think I know what your password is. So
yeah, well, I mean, I think that speaks to human behavior. That's not going to change, and so this need for security and for identity security specifically is, you talk about the original point of voice biometrics. I remember we had a conference some 10 years back where there was the guy from PayPal and talking about, today, this year is going to be the end of passwords. No more passwords, and that was 10 years ago. So I think there is just an inevitability about the security risks that are going to be a part of accounts and organizations, and certainly within both the employee and the customer. So
I think it's like humans or people, customers, employees, they want security but will choose convenience every time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, but Dan T, when we're saying inherent in a funny way, we really mean biometrics, and since we are who we are, we mean voice biometrics. So when you think about the era of zero trust, what are the considerations for implementing zero trust identity security, using voice biometrics?
So I think maybe, so if we talk about biometrics generally, then I can touch on voice, because I think, there is we have to look at what the risk of the transactions are, first of all, and also what channels the employee or individual is interacting on. Because, fundamentally there are different ways to implement inherence. The great thing about voice biometrics is its versatility, right? So, we've been talking a lot here today about how do we secure employee access, agent access, and then the complexity. If we talked about the retail world, there's a whole load more complexity there, right? So the voice biometrics at its raw is about an individual speaking, doing something that is completely natural to somebody, and then fundamentally we're tying the sounds of that they make to the inherent physical makeup of them, right? So that takes away all this necessity for worrying about securing SMSs or emails or all of this sort of stuff. And then because voice is so applicable to many different channels, so you speak into smart speakers, or you've got a microphone on your laptop, or you've got an earbud in your ear, or you've got a telephone that you can receive calls on. It's an extremely versatile way of being able to have consistent security across all of these different channels. Even web browsers, you can now speak directly into web browsers very simply, right? So the implementation of voice biometrics, while there might be some complexity in technically how do you make all of these things work, and that's ValidSoft's issue to solve, right? We're here to make it really simple and consumable for our clients and customers. But basically, as an end user, you're just speaking. You're just naturally speaking, and it's a very simple, very versatile way of authenticating. And as Matt said earlier, because if you include random digits in it, you're getting all of these other factors essentially for free. You're getting this cryptographic OTP, which the consumer doesn't know it's cryptographically tied to location or whatever it's tied to. They just know I've got a code, I've got to speak, and it lets me in. So you get all of these other things for free. So the mechanisms of that is simply present an OTP and the user speaks, and you can apply that. I mean, us alone, we've applied it into self-service in IVRs, IVAs, in web browsers, in apps, in smart speakers. Not as much. That's something that's gaining.
Oh boy, you froze.
Did the
Let's
hurricane come
assume
by?
that smart speakers are proliferating, and Daniel's in a bandwidth challenged island, but
Yeah,
So-
it looks like we may have lost him. So I think we're kind of closing up here too, so we can start to move to Q&A. Well, and first, let's go ahead and put the slide up, Dan, about the event and then the Q&A.
Sure, just one sec. I do see the Q&A. So just a reminder of what we have gone through. I think we covered all of our questions here, but what I hope we've done is, Daniel is back. Can you hear us, Dan?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've literally just come through. I live on a small Caribbean island. We've literally just come through Hurricane Fiona, so there's some intermittent internet issues I'm suffering from. So apologies for that.
So you're back just in time for the Q&A. And we were sort of taking the opportunity to say, so we're opening some of, this is an example of the type of discussions we expect to see at the Intelligent Authentication and Fraud Prevention Conference coming up in December in London.
We're looking forward to it. So it's December 1st in London. And we certainly will be talking about the need for identity security and voice biometrics and the applications across both employees and consumers. In addition, as we've talked about, we're looking at a multimodal world. So we'll also be looking at network authentication and behavioral biometrics and utilizing all the different security factors that could go into assessing risk and then providing that level of security that businesses need. So we have several case studies and presentations. We have from Lloyd's Banking Group will be there, and Pat Carroll, who is the CEO of ValidSoft, will be presenting as well. So we'd love to have you join us, and please do. If you go to iothconference.net, you'll get more information.
And we do have questions that came in.
Well, I saw the first one. It was about the name of the book. It's right here. Unlock Your Call Center.
Yeah, that's the easy question.
Easy. Okay,
yeah,
but
exactly.
here's one.
Go to the other ones. Yeah.
Okay, the EU seems to be encouraging voice biometric authentication through regulations, if you agree with that. in the US, there seems to be a legal battle and some class action lawsuits creating a wait and see approach to use this technology. This is the BIPA question. It says, how do you overcome reluctance to adopt voice biometrics as a solution in the US? Is regulation in the US on the horizon? So,
my favorite topic, Stan.
okay, so yeah, let's volleyball this around. You can go first, Matt.
I love this subject of regulation because it's like the first system there was no regulations available when we first implemented these systems, so we basically had to make stuff up. But I think the principles are really important. Like as we've said throughout this, like biometrics, voice biometrics particularly, it's an inherent part of someone's individual identity, and therefore it's completely right that an individual should want to feel some control over that element of themselves. And therefore in every system we've ever implemented, we've always had some element of whether it be formal or explicit consent, but certainly the permission or the knowledge of the individuals whose voices are being used and whose biometric factors are being analyzed, so that they can make an informed decision about whether that's something they want to do or not. And a lot of the legislation that's been introduced subsequently has merely kind of codified that, and to some extent provided kind of helpful guardrails for which we can make sure that we don't trip ourselves up. There are some exceptions in Illinois, particularly, which makes that really challenging. Obviously, every organization implementing this technology needs to be confident of the legal basis under which they're doing it, but we do see a number of legal bases under which organizations can deploy this technology, but most often that's with the knowledge and consent of the individuals whose biometrics are being captured, and that's the best practice that we encourage everyone to use.
Right. So there is regulation. It militates towards informed consent for storage of biometric data, whatever you want to call it, that is getting more and more identified as personally identifiable information. So in a way, you want to treat a voice print much as you would any other personalized information. And yeah, the question is there regulation in the US on the horizon? It still seems like it's state by state, but between California and stuff going on at the federal level, yes, no doubt about it. So we shall see.
But I think importantly, people shouldn't view that as a blocker, because when individuals, customers, or employees are asked in the right way whether they want to do that, like, can we stop sending you these annoying texts and you just read out your PIN number every time you call us? Like, it's a no-brainer. It's the human equivalent. It's the seeking convenience. Yeah, it's easier. Right. So when presented in the right way, the vast majority of individuals will give their permission and consent.
Right.
And that's been our experience.
And we're just overcoming a period of time where it was believed that opting out, setting up an opting out situation would always get you more than opting in. We're at a situation where you do have to do a sale. You do have to get people to opt in. And Matt's, hey, the vast majority will do it when you prove that it's going to be more convenient. It's moving the needle from the, hey, 20% would agree to, with hope 80%, but it is, it's effective. And as Matt was saying, I wouldn't use it as a reason to not try.
And there's a great book here you can buy.
Enough. And then probably as a last question, because we are bumping up against time, about what percent of calls into the IVR are a threat, people trying to get credentials for account takeover, and what percent of agent handled, my thing just jumped, contacts are account takeover percent. I don't have, this is like sort of, since not all of them are successful, and with hope, very few of them are successful, you're kind of measuring a negative here, unless you know different than I. I mean, and this is sort of the purpose of zero trust. Treat them all as an effort to do an attack and come up with, tactical approaches that also make them convenient. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there's the age-old conundrum.
That's it. I mean, I think this question, it's a very hard question to answer actually, because it probably depends on, you know, the type of business you're in,
business,
geography,
scale.
scale, all of these types of things, repeat call rates of your customers, you know, things like that. But, you know, studies have shown that, you know, implementing, you know, voice biometrics in the contact center has reduced fraud by, you know, 80, 90%, but it does depend on many, many factors. So one statistic won't apply necessarily to another business, because, you know, it's about risk too, right? So not all contact centers deal with the same level of risk as others. So it's a very, very subjective question.
Yeah, I mean, as planning figures, I mean, this is mostly about consumer facing more than it is about employee facing. But in the consumer facing kind of large retail banks in North America and the UK and Australia and New Zealand, we'd sometimes see maybe up to 1 in 500 calls be from imposters. And in kind of brokerage and retail and telco, we'd see that far lower, maybe 1 in 2,500, 1 in 5,000 calls. And those are just really, really rough planning figures, but they very much, as Dan says, depend on the scale of the organization. But what I don't think you should see is that these are not these are just part of a multi-pronged attacks every time. Like an IVR is an amazing way to figure out when people get paid. So if I've got the credentials for their account, I can empty it on the right day. It's an amazing way of figuring out whether or not the credit card numbers I've brought from the dark web are actually valid or not. Whereas an agent might be a way in which I can figure out what the age of the account holder is, or some other information about them, so that I can compromise them at a different organization. So it's not necessarily about that being the point of loss or a specific takeover attempt at that point. So it's more complex. And again, there is some helpful information here.
I think another thing to keep it, like, just to add to this, you know, question is, it's not, we focus a lot here on attacks and security and authentication, but there is also a convenience factor to this, and a making this better, simpler and faster for your employees. So whether that saves operational cost to your business, increases, you know, employee satisfaction. There's lots of other softer metrics that actually apply too. It's not just about security.
100%.
Well, good. This has been really, really helpful, and we've definitely touched on a lot of topics here, and I definitely feel like we have some ways to go. So really appreciate ValidSoft being a part of the webinar today, and Dan T. You know, your thoughts and was very helpful. So yeah, so I think we'll wrap up here. And again, if people have any questions or any further you know, comments, or please feel free to follow up with any of us offline, and we'll be sure to answer those questions. So, all right, thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye-bye then.
Bye.